Chapter 17 of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Chapter 17 of the Holy War by John Bunyan. So order was given out by the Lord Mayor, that wise and trusty friend of the town of Mansoul, that persons should be employed about this necessary business. And Mr. Godly Fear and one Mr. Upright were to be overseers about this matter. So persons were put under them to work in the fields and to bury the slain that lay dead in the plains, and these were their places of employment. Some were to make graves, some to bury the dead, and some were to go to and fro in the plains, and also round about the borders of Mansoul, to see if a skull or a bone or a piece of a bone of a doubter was yet to be found above ground anywhere near the corporation. And if any were found, it was ordered that the searchers that searched should set up a mark thereby, and a sign, that those that were appointed to bury them might find it, and bury it out of sight, that the name and remembrance of a Diabolonian doubter might be blotted out from under heaven, and that the children, and they that were to be born in Mansoul, might not know, if possible, what a skull, what a bone, or a piece of a bone of a doubter was. So the buriers and those that were appointed for that purpose did as they were commanded. They buried the doubters and all the skulls and bones, and pieces of bones of doubters, wherever they found them. And so they cleansed the plains. Now also Mr. God's Peace took up his commission, and acted again as in former days. Thus they buried in the plains about Mansoul the election doubters, the vocation doubters, the grace doubters, the perseverance doubters, the resurrection doubters, the salvation doubters, and the glory doubters, whose captains were Captain Rage, Captain Cruel, Captain Damnation, Captain Insatiable, Captain Brimstone, Captain Torment, Captain No Ease, Captain Sepulchre, and Captain Past Hope. And old Incredulity was, under Diabolus, their general. There were also the 7 heads of their army, and they were the Lord Beelzebub, the Lord Lucifer, the Lord Legion, the Lord Apollyon, the Lord Python, the Lord Cerberus, and the Lord Belial. But the princes and the captains, with old Incredulity their general, did all of them make their escape. So their men fell down slain by the power of the princes' forces, and by the hands of the men of the town of Mansoul. They also were buried as is afore related, to the exceeding great joy of the now famous town of Mansoul. They that buried them buried also with them their arms, which were cruel instruments of death, their weapons with arrows, darts, mauls, firebrands, and the like. They buried also their armour, their colours, banners, with the standard of Diabolus, and what elsesoever they could find that did but smell of a Diabolonian doubter. Now when the tyrant had arrived at Hellgate Hill with his old friend Incredulity, they immediately descended the den, and having there with their fellows for a while condoled their misfortune and great loss that they sustained against the town of Mansoul, they fell at length into a passion, and revenged they would be for the loss that they sustained before the town of Mansoul. Wherefore they presently called council to contrive yet further what was to be done against the famous town of Mansoul. For their yawning paunches could not wait to see the result of their Lord Lucifer's and their Lord Apollyon's counsel that they had given before. For their raging gorge thought every day, even as long as a short for ever, until they were filled with the body and soul, with the flesh and bones, and with all the delicates of Mansoul. They therefore resolved to make another attempt upon the town of Mansoul, and that by an army mixed and made up partly of doubters and partly of bloodmen. A more particular account now take of both. The doubters are such as have their name from their nature, as well as from the land and kingdom where they are born. Their nature is to put a question upon every one of the truths of Emmanuel, and their country is called the land of doubting, and that land lieth off and farthest remote to the north, between the land of darkness and that called the valley of the shadow of death. For though the land of darkness and that called the valley of the shadow of death be sometimes called as if they were one and the self-same place, yet indeed they are two, lying but a little way asunder, and the land of doubting points in and lieth between them. This is the land of doubting, and these that came with Diabolus to ruin the town of Mansoul are the natives of that country. The bloodmen are a people that have their name derived from the malignity of their nature, and from the fury that is in them to execute it upon the town of Mansoul. Their land lieth under the dog-star, and by that they are governed as to their intellectuals. The name of their country is the province of Loath-good. The remote parts of it are far distant from the land of doubting, yet they do both butt and bound upon the hill called Hellgate Hill. These people are always in league with the doubters, for they jointly do make question of the faith and fidelity of the men of the town of Mansoul, and so are both alike qualified for the service of their prince. Now of these two countries did Diabolus, by the beating of his drum, raise another army against the town of Mansoul, of 25,000 strong. There were 10,000 doubters, and 15,000 bloodmen, and they were put under several captains for the war, and old Incredulity was again made general of the army. As for the doubters, their captains were 5 of the 7 that were heads of the last Diabolonian army, and these are their names: Captain Beelzebub, Captain Lucifer, Captain Apollyon, Captain Legion, and Captain Cerberus. And the captains that they had before were some of them made lieutenants, and some ensigns of the army. But Diabolus did not count that, in this expedition of his, these doubters would prove his principal men, for their manhood had been tried before. Also the Mansoulians had put them to the worst. Only he did bring them to multiply in number, and to help, if need was, at a pinch. But his trust he put in his bloodmen, for that they were all rugged villains, and he knew that they had done feats heretofore. As for the bloodmen, they also were under command, and the names of their captains were Captain Cain, Captain Nimrod, Captain Ishmael, Captain Esau, Captain Saul, Captain Absalom, Captain Judas, and Captain Pope. 1. Captain Cain was over 2 bands, namely, the zealous and the angry bloodmen. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was the murdering club. 2. Captain Nimrod was captain over 2 bands, namely, the tyrannical and encroaching bloodmen. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was the great bloodhound. 3. Captain Ishmael was captain over 2 bands, namely, the mocking and scorning bloodmen. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was one mocking at Abraham's Isaac. 4. Captain Esau was captain over 2 bands, namely, the bloodmen that grudged that another should have the blessing, also over the bloodmen that are for executing their private revenge upon others. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was one privately lurking to murder Jacob. 5. Captain Saul was captain over 2 bands, namely, the groundlessly jealous and the devilishly furious bloodmen. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was 3 bloody darts cast at harmless David. 6. Captain Absalom was captain over 2 bands, namely, over the bloodmen that will kill a father or a friend for the glory of this world, also over those bloodmen that will hold one fair in hand with words, till they shall have pierced him with their swords. His standard-bearer did bear the red colours, and his scutcheon was the son pursuing the father's blood. 7. Captain Judas was over 2 bands, namely, the bloodmen that will sell a man's life for money, and those also that will betray their friend with a kiss. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was 30 pieces of silver and the halter. 8. Captain Pope was captain over 1 band, for all these spirits are joined in one under him. His standard-bearer bare the red colours, and his scutcheon was the stake, the flame, and the good man in it. Now the reason why Diabolus did so soon rally another force, after he had been beaten out of the field, was, for that he put mighty confidence in this army of bloodmen. For he put a great deal of more trust in them than he did before in his army of doubters, though they had also often done great service for him in the strengthening of him in his kingdom. But these bloodmen, he had proved them often, and their sword did seldom return empty.